Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Kaisinger, and as always, on behalf of Studio B and our entire team, I wish to welcome you to today's session. Today's session actually marks the fourth week of our journey into the notion of steadiness. And I wanted to open with this slide. I think what's really interesting about this slide is I believe it was probably week 2 of our steadiness teachings. Our founder and CEO, Jennifer Sirambuli, was out in nature with her family, and she took this photo of the Karen most often found in nature. And the Karen really does represent what it means to be steady, because the Karen is all about balance, it's all about integration, and it's also about natural intelligence and wisdom. And if I could consolidate or sort of drill down on some of the major key concepts that we have journeyed through over the course of the last 3.5 weeks, those would be really important concepts: balance, integration, and natural wisdom. So I love that this photograph has become something that I've been trying to share with you each week, because it really does serve as a nice representation of what the last 4 weeks have been about. So as you're going out into your world over the course of the next several weeks and months, I want you to keep this image in mind, remembering that you too have the capacity for balance, for integration, and the ability to really drop down and into your own wisdom. And that's really what steadiness is all about. So where have we been? Where have we been over the course of the last 4 weeks? I just want to take a moment to sort of provide an overview. If you are with us for the first time, welcome. And I want to remind you, actually, I want to remind all of you that if you are here, you have access to our entire resilience and steadiness series. So you can go all the way back and work through the first 4 weeks, which was our resilience training, and then into the content that's already been presented related to steadiness. But in terms of where we've been over the course of the last 3.5 weeks, we began by taking a very deep dive into stress, particularly the stress response as it gets activated in the brain, and then all of the different ways that it gets expressed, not just physiologically, but in terms of our cognitive functioning, in terms of our emotional well-being. It spills into our relationships and our relational dynamics, and it certainly impacts our professional work in the world, our effectiveness, our productivity, the degree of burnout that we can come to experience. My goal during that module on stress was to have you get to a point where you could walk away from those lessons with 3 to 5 key indicators that constitute what I call your stress signature. Why is that important? It's important because it begins to build a really powerful foundation for awareness. If I know that stress tends to manifest and gets expressed through me, first through my gastrointestinal system, which is where I tend to feel it first, then through my breath, and then in brain scramble or brain fog, I know that when those 3 symptoms are present, that stress is present. And then I have the opportunity to take a moment and decide what it is that I'm going to do about the presence of those stress cues. So your stress signature is really important as an incredibly powerful source of information that keeps you very aware of the presence of stress. And again, it puts you in the driver's seat because you get to decide, you get to choose how you're going to best manage that. Remembering, stress expresses itself very differently in all of us. That's why I use the term signature. We know that our signatures, like our thumbprints, are very unique to us. They're not the same. So is your stress signature. It doesn't manifest the same way as it does in other people. So get to know yourself a little bit better by having a very clear sense of the way that stress is expressed in and through you. During the second week, we looked at what is called the whole health Karen. Again, going back to that original image. Remembering that during that lesson, my goal was to really shift your paradigm or our paradigm in terms of how we look at the notion of whole health, how we look at whole health and what it means to be healthy holistically. We worked with the image of the Karen, remembering that whole health is deeply rooted in our capacity for stability, balance, steadiness, that there are all kinds of aspects that constitute your well-being. We looked at creativity. We looked at relationship and intimacy. We looked at money as part of well-being. We looked at all of these various stones that constitute a whole life. And the question was, how can I bring balance and well-being to each of those stones? Just like the Karen in nature, it will topple. It will not withstand various weather conditions if it is not balanced and if the stones are not integrally related. They're interdependently related. They need each other to stand tall. But the best part of the whole health Karen is always remembering what it sits upon. The foundational stone of your whole health is not your physical health. The foundational stone of your whole health is your intuition. And what was fun about intuition was we got very serious about the neurology of intuition. Where does intuition live in the brain? And during that part of our teaching, we looked at the very important connection between intuition and the right side of the brain, the hippocampus, the heart, and the gut, and the role that each of these parts plays in your capacity to have access to a very, very deep inner guidance system. So we've got neurology to back this up. When I have a deep knowing about someone or something, it is the result of a connection between the right side of my brain, the hippocampus, the wisdom of my own heart, neurologically speaking, and the wisdom of my gut. And we talked about the brain that actually exists in the gut, that neurological system that is connected to our physical brain. So when my intuition is strong, I have a really clear sense of what each of the parts need most from me in order to have the experience of whole health, in order to stand strong and tall and balanced like the Karen in nature, so that when the winds and rains and floods, heavy waters come, or the searing heat, we find Karens in the desert as well. When all of that comes, I'm able to still stand. I'm able to maintain my strength and my equilibrium. During week 3 of this journey, I introduced you to Dr. David Rock's SCARF model. The SCARF model is a game changer because it gets us in touch with what threatens us in the first place, what triggers us in the first place. Remember, we moved through each of the letters of that acronym. It gives us very, very clear insight into what we as human beings really, really need, what is most important to us, and what happens to us when any one of those needs are threatened. The SCARF model is a game changer Because number one, when I get up close and personal with why I get triggered in the first place, I promise you, your triggering and all of the charge that's associated with triggering starts to dissipate pretty significantly. So that when I start to feel all those symptoms of being triggered, I can take a moment, I can step back, and I can run myself through SCARF and get a lot of insight into why the triggering is occurring in the first place. But I also mentioned that the second value, and sometimes this feels even more important for me, the second value of that model is that when people around me or someone around me is being very triggered, really upset, angered, grief-stricken, whatever it is, really upset, in a high state of discomfort, when I notice that happening, I too can take a moment, I can step back, I can run myself through SCARF, and I can ask, in what ways is this person here in my life also being triggered by one of the 5 factors that exist in that model? And when I can have insight into why you're triggered, and I'm your parent, or I'm your spouse, or I'm your friend, or I'm your leader, or I'm your coworker, when I can understand why it is that you're triggered, I have a much higher capacity to come in to that moment relationally with a whole lot of patience and empathy and understanding. In other words, I can be a productive force in the moment of your own triggering. Is what we know about human beings. It's very natural to us. We can go there really quickly. Is that triggering is contagious. When you're triggered, I can get triggered. So the wisdom of SCARF is well worth going back and looking into. If you were with us for that lesson, if you weren't with us for that lesson, please go back. I mentioned that when I was first introduced to the model, I wrote it down. I wrote the acronym down on a cue card, and I carried it around with me for a month. And every time I felt triggered, I looked at that cue card and I ran myself through SCARF. And it gave me a lot of insight, a lot of insight. But more than anything else, it forced me to pause. Oh, I feel the sensation of triggering. My heart rate's increasing. My body temperature is increasing. I'm feeling that gastrointestinal sign that triggering is occurring. So what's happening here? Taking that pause, running myself through SCARF. When you work with SCARF for a whole month, by the end of the month, you know it by heart, and then it's always with you. This week's dedication is really looking at the role of compassion and self-compassion in the cultivation of steadiness. And it really makes a lot of sense for us to land here at the end, because compassion and self-compassion, I think all of us would agree, are really beautiful qualities. But how do we cultivate them? How do we practice them? And what do they really mean for us in our own lived experience? Before we launch into compassion, there is a missing piece. There is something that I wanted to include that we didn't have a chance to get to last week related to triggers. These are 2 questions and 2 statements that I would like for you to work at. This is called the trigger inquiry. And I came up with these questions and statements for a really important reason. And if you can work with these and spend a little bit of time, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, the information that you will glean, or the insight that you will glean from this really brief exercise, can be very invaluable. So if you were just to take a few moments and complete this phrase, it makes me crazy when. How would you complete that? For example, it makes me crazy when I'm cut off in traffic. It makes me crazy when people are late, or when events start late. It makes me crazy when it seems like there are 5 additional trailers to a movie before the actual movie starts. In other words, or the tone of voice in my daughter when she's really agitated makes me crazy. In other words, what situations take you from 0 to 100 really, really quickly, even if you're a regular meditator, even if you're very, very mindful about these things? We all have these situations and individuals who trigger us pretty regularly in a way that we can't quite seem to interrupt or halt. So why is it important to complete that? When I work with this, what I like to do is just come up with the first 3 to 5 things that come to mind. It makes me crazy when. This will heighten your awareness. And with that heightened awareness, you can almost prepare yourself for the next time you're coming close to encountering that particular situation. So the next time I'm driving and someone cuts me off in traffic and I begin to feel the charge of that, I can kind of pause and say, all right, that was on my list, and I have the awareness now. Question: who in my life triggers me? Similar to the first phrase, who in my life triggers me? Again, we all have 3 to 5 people that, regardless of how we're related to them, regardless of how we know them, how long we've known them, how briefly we've known, we all have people in our lives that for whatever reason really trigger us. We go from 0 to 100 by being in their presence, by the tone of their voice, whatever it is. How would you complete that sentence? Why is that important? Because if you can complete that sentence, then you begin having some ability to prepare. Oh, I know that I can count on next Thanksgiving that this person is going to be seated across from me at the table. And this person made my list, my trigger inquiry list. So I can prepare for that. In other words, I'm not going to go into the situation without consciousness about the fact that I'm about to be in the presence of someone who really triggers me. And with that awareness, I get to decide what I'm going to do about that. Last question here on the screen. Who in my life walks me away from the ledge? Who are those individuals that you reach out to when you feel like you are on your last nerve, when you feel like you're just going to blow, when you're feeling a very, very high degree of upset? The first 3 to 5 people who make your list, in fact, the first person who comes to mind, I promise you that they came to mind because they already possess a high capacity to step into a very responsive mindset. In other words, these are individuals, or this is an individual who's probably not going to be reactive when you tell them what it is that's going on with you, when you reach out to them because you need them to kind of walk you back from the ledge. This question is really important because it helps to illuminate support. Who can I rely on as my main sources for support when I'm highly triggered, or when I know that I'm entering into a situation that might be really triggering? So who are those individuals? So I want you to have awareness. So finish that first phrase. I want you to have prevention by making that list of those people who trigger you. I want you to answer the question about support so that you're really, really clear about those individuals that you can reach out to. And you'll notice that I left the second phrase here for last because it's one of the most important. How would you complete this sentence? I don't like myself when. I don't like myself when. I don't like myself when I take that tone with my daughter when I'm feeling really frustrated in helping with her homeschooling. I don't like myself when I turn and walk away from a conflict that I know needs to be resolved. I don't like myself when I've had a situation that I just know I didn't handle very well, or I don't like myself when I don't take a moment before I press send, when I'm composing an email or writing a text message that is related to something that has triggered me. Why is this important? This is important for two reasons. It really shows you in a pretty radical way some of the behaviors that you're already engaged in on a pretty regular basis that probably need some attention because you are acting out of a reactive mindset. But it also shows you something that's very important to today's lesson. It really illuminates the way in which you can be self-judgmental, self-critical. And this is really important because we all get triggered. All of us mess up all of the time. It doesn't matter what your experience is. So the acknowledgement, I just got triggered. I don't feel like I handled that very well. I don't want to do that again. That's one thing. But when we layer upon that self-judgment, self-criticism, when we badger, bully, berate ourselves for that behavior, then we have added an unnecessary second layer of stress. So when I teach about this phrase and why it's really important, I like to share the following story. And this is really the reason why this statement is on this slide. Several years ago, when I was in a therapy session with my son, we were working through some issues related to mother-son relationship that many of us face. The therapist took a pause and she looked at me and she said, "You know, Christine, I don't think you like yourself very much as a mother in these particular episodes with your son." And the statement really went right to my heart. I just burst into tears because she was spot on. That was part of the problem. I didn't like myself. I didn't like the tone I was using or this part of myself that would come up during these episodes. And not only did I not like the way I was handling the situation, but I was also judging myself, badgering myself for those behaviors. So this second phrase is a really important one to consider. Whenever you say or do something from a place of reactivity and being really triggered, there's a strong possibility that after the fact, you'll look back on the situation and say, "Oh, I wish I had handled that differently. I wish I didn't go there with that person. I wish I didn't use that tone," whatever it is. And there's also a possibility that you will layer upon that some sort of judgment and criticism of yourself. So every time that feeling comes up, that feeling of, "Oh, I don't like how I handled that. I don't like what that was all about," take a moment and just say, "Okay, that came from reactivity. I'm a human being. This happens all the time. It will continue to happen. Perhaps there's another way I can handle that if I'm in this situation again," but try to prevent or avoid layering on the judgment and the criticism. In other words, have compassion for that human being that you are. Our triggering, our reactive nature comes from this beautiful brain of ours that's all ready to go when we perceive threat and when we are in the presence of true threat. It is there for us. And it's really important that we honor that aspect of the brain. But it's also completely possible for us to come to a place in our own lives where we can mind our own mind. We can mind our mind. We can tend to our own mind in a way that really illuminates. These are my triggers. And in knowing them and in having the awareness that, it's coming up, I feel it. I feel these changes, these physiological changes coming. I see my train of thought shifting. These are all signals, triggering. We have the opportunity and the wisdom to interrupt and to make a different choice. And we have the opportunity, whenever it is that we find ourselves handling it in a way that we wished we hadn't, we have the opportunity to be tremendously compassionate. And this is where we are today, is really looking at the role that compassion and self-compassion we'll actually spend quite a bit of time on in our next lesson, but the role that both of these play in what it means to be steady. So, compassion. I believe that everyone would agree that compassion is a good thing. And we would say that, most people will say that and say it with great confidence because we've each had the experience of feeling compassion. And when I feel great compassion for another person or a group of people, it creates a softening in my own heart and a calm in my own mind that I actually can find rest and respite in. Compassion feels good. At the same time, when I am the recipient of compassion, it also feels good. So most would agree that compassion is a good thing, but why? Let's dive deep into that. In the Buddhist tradition, and I love this, compassion is defined as a quivering heart in response to suffering. A quivering heart. When you feel compassion, because you are confronted with, you are seeing, sensing, experiencing another person's suffering, it literally causes a trembling in your own heart, a quivering. You are moved. That is why if you were to say to someone, most people would immediately place their hands right here, center chest, near the heart, and in some cases on the solar plexus, but mostly right here in the heart, because it's actually physically felt as coming from this place. A more formal definition of compassion is the sensing and the experiencing of suffering and the desire to alleviate it. This is really important. I not only sense that there is suffering present, but I have a very strong desire to take action to alleviate it. Why is this important? This is important because many people believe or talk about compassion and empathy as if they are the same thing, and they're not. And you'll understand why in a moment. So when I'm feeling compassion for another person suffering, man, I feel it, I see it, I want to do something. And an example of that is how many of us have wanted to take really important action over the course of the last 10 weeks because we are seeing globally suffering related to our pandemic, and we want to do something. And many of us are confined to our own homes, and we're not sure how we can contribute. And some of us feel like we're crawling out of our skin because we want to contribute. Man, that's the compassionate urge in you, turned on full blast. And you can think about times in your life where, yeah, you did whatever you could. You had the fuel, you had the drive to do because you want to alleviate it. So empathy is different. Empathy is, I see and I sense suffering, but I don't take action to change it. I don't do anything to try to change it, eliminate it, fix it, repair it. Really important. I don't do anything to try to minimize this person's suffering or to diminish it. I don't try to talk them out of their suffering. Empathy, defined, is the ability to sit with, to be with another person in their suffering. Empathy is hard. We're naturally hardwired for empathy and compassion, and I'll talk about why that is next time. We are, but empathy is something that gets cultivated and really strengthened and kind of grown over time with experiences. We really have to know and understand what empathy is in order to practice it. And the more that we practice it, the better we get at it. And this is important because sometimes what I need from someone else is just empathy. This is especially true in situations that really can't be changed, situations that I really can't control. So let's say I've got a situation like that. I'm suffering. There's a situation happening in my life that I can't control, I really can't change, and it's just causing a lot of suffering. Grieving is a really good example of this, grieving a loss. If another person in my life offers me empathy, the response might be something like, "This seems really hard, and I'm sorry." The response might be something like, "I have no words. There are no words that I can call upon right now, but I just want you to know that I'm here." This is valuable because the person who is suffering, if you try to talk them out of, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or this situation is going to change, I promise you, or this isn't really happening, you're seeing it the wrong way. Any way of talking them out of their own discomfort is not kind. So it's important. It's sort of a line that we need to be very, very aware of. Is this situation calling for compassion? Is this situation calling for empathy? When the call is tough, pay attention to how this person is talking with you. Unless you ask me directly for advice or feedback, I'm probably going to give you empathy. Unless you ask me pretty directly to take some sort of action, I'm probably going to offer empathy. So think about both compassion and empathy as two qualities that we as human beings are very capable of. We know through studies that when we watch very young children, even toddlers, watching footage, for example, it might be put together as a cartoon where one of the key characters is hurting. Even toddlers will start to cry, that they recognize and they resonate with hurt. Now, they don't know that they to call that compassion or empathy, but it's there. It's natural, it's there. But the question is, do we practice it? Can we get practiced in it? And the answer is yes. Our capacity for compassion really starts to open up when we are willing to be vulnerable. Really important. Think about it. The last time you felt great compassion for someone, there's something in you that opened up to their pain. If you're really closed down, if you're really feeling defended or defensive, you're not going to experience compassion. It's not possible. Compassion and defensiveness, they don't live in the same body. They're not going to get expressed in the same heart. So it's important that we think about, how undefended am I right now in the face of this person's suffering? Can I drop my shoulders, bring them back a little bit, take a couple of deep breaths, so that expansiveness of compassion becomes possible. So compassion needs to be accompanied by vulnerability. Additionally, it's important to know that we open up our capacity for compassion when we can also participate in what is called shared vulnerability. And this means that we connect to the willingness of those around us to be vulnerable as well. This is important in terms of what's happening on the globe right now. Part of what makes compassion easier for so many of us is that we know we're not alone. We're all feeling rather vulnerable right now. It's almost like permission. We have permission to soften to the world's suffering. And we're doing it together. Which brings me to the next line, and that is that compassion both requires and it inspires that softening. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But I want to conclude this slide by saying that compassion is good for all of us. And I started here. No one would argue that compassion isn't good. But why? So let's take a peek into the neuroscience of compassion. I want you to think about this as I'm moving through the three options that your own neurological system takes on when you are in a state of threat or high stress. Usually one of these three things happen. We've already spent a lot of time, both in resilience and the steadiness course, talking about the stress response. Something happens, it feels like a threat to me, I have a lot of discomfort about it. So one of the things that might happen in response to the discomfort is stress response turns on. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to fight this. I don't want this to be happening. Get out of my life. Please stop this, whatever it is. Or I'm going to run as far as I can away from this. Or I'm just going to freeze and sort of go into that paralysis so I don't have to feel this because it's too much. The stress response is mitigated, we know this, by cortisol and adrenaline. That cortisol comes in, it gets me ready to fight, it gets me ready to run, it gets me ready to freeze, because freezing and shutting down takes so much energy. So the stress response, it's there for us, thank goodness. Sometimes we really need it, but we don't need it all the time. So for someone who has felt discomfort and threat and always living as if they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, whatever it is, stress response might be a way that you've been living for a very long time. So that's one of our options. That's one of the neurological systems that might kick in when discomfort is present. There's also another option, and this is known as the pleasure-reward response, which is moderated by dopamine. So, easiest example, we've all done this. We all do this. Something has happened. It's really upsetting. It's causing a lot of discomfort for me. And I find myself standing in front of the refrigerator, getting ready to pull out or to prepare my favorite comfort food. The magic trio for the production of dopamine that's going to make me feel like I'm just surrounded by a warm, comforting blanket is the combination of fat, sugar, and salt. So think Snickers bar. Think of your favorite comfort food in the presence of fat, sugar, and salt. And if they're all there together, you've got a powerful trio there. Dopamine. So the thing about the pleasure reward response is that we've got discomfort. So we're going to reach for something that's going to make us feel good. It can be a substance we eat, something we drink. It can be an activity. We know that scrolling through Facebook, for example, we know this factually, that it has a lulling effect, that there's something pleasurable and rewarding about it that takes us out of the discomfort, but only temporarily. What we know about dopamine is that the comfort will eventually subside, and then we're back to square one. We're back to feeling the discomfort again. And so these kinds of behaviors become or land in the land of addiction when we become very accustomed to the dopamine and we start seeking it. I want to be really clear that all of us fall into the stress response. All of us might choose pleasure reward response, although we're not even aware we're choosing it. And then we have a new opportunity. And this is something that we know fairly new about our own neurology, is that there is something that is called the tend and befriend response that is moderated by the hormone oxytocin. So here's what tend and befriend looks like. Something uncomfortable happens, something's upsetting to me, I feel threatened in some way. So discomfort is present. Step number 1, I'm really aware that I'm suffering here. This is really uncomfortable. So rather than going into stress response, fighting it, running from it, freezing, rather than going to pleasure reward response, whatever that is for me, going to the refrigerator, escaping in 2 hours of online engagement, I'm going to do tend and befriend, which, by the way, is a response that is very conscious, very, very intentional on our part. And that is, I'm actually going to tend to the discomfort that I feel. I'm going to give it attention. Discomfort is here. I'm just going to take some time and sort of scoop that up and hold it close. I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to numb because of it. Imagine a child who's learning how to ride a bike for the first time. And they're up and they're down and they're up and they're down and they're up and they're down and they fall down eventually and they scrape their knee and it's bleeding and the child is screaming. And as the adult, what would you do? You would tend and befriend. You wouldn't lash out at the child in fight mode. You wouldn't run away. You wouldn't shut down. You wouldn't seek dopamine. You would go to the child, scoop him or her up, provide comfort. You would tend to the discomfort in a way that is friendly, kind, tender, nurturing. That makes sense to a lot of us. I think we would all agree. That's a beautiful way. It's a different way. It's an intentional way of managing or meeting my discomfort. But there's something more to the picture here. And that is that when you tend and befriend, especially to your own discomfort, you yourself begin to produce oxytocin. And as you know from previous lessons, oxytocin in shorthand is known as the bonding hormone. It's the hormone that's flowing strong and free when we're holding an infant. It's the hormone that gets activated when we get really, really close to and hold and pet and connect to animals. It's one of the reasons why pet therapy is so powerful, especially with children who are ill, children who are autistic, really powerful in nursing homes, extremely powerful with Alzheimer's patients, because every human being, if you are alive, you have the capacity to generate oxytocin. And when oxytocin is present, there's a beautiful sense of calm and steadiness and stability in the body. So what does it look like? The presence of oxytocin, tend and befriend, puts you in a position to quite naturally extend compassion and receive compassion. When we tend and befriend, when we make the choice in response to our own discomfort, this is how I'm going to meet it. These are some of the things we can count on happening. I can count on coming to a place of comfort and stability. I can count on softening. It's like someone has come to my rescue, much like the mother or father who comes to the rescue of the child who's just fallen off the bike. Someone is here, and it's me, offering stability and comfort. And so I start to feel softer, and I start to open up, and there's vulnerability present. Softness and vulnerability present will lead to compassion. I am more apt to, or I will have a higher capacity for closeness and intimacy when I opt to tend and befriend. And here's the most important thing. When you tend and befriend, when you choose that that is how you're going to meet your own discomfort, it will never drain or deplete you like the other options will. Stress response will drain and deplete you, especially if you're in it chronically. Pleasure reward response will drain and deplete you if that is your go-to. Tend and befriend is truly a way of nurturing yourself, of nourishing yourself. It's highly reparative, and it restores your energy. What does it mean to say that it's highly reparative? If you have lived with chronic states of stress, like most of us, for a good deal of your life, that has taken quite a toll on your central nervous system. It's kind of beat it up. And some of us have central nervous systems that are pretty ragged as a result. And the way that we want to think about the central nervous system is much like we would think about the electrical system in our own home. So let's say electrical system, for whatever reason, you've blown a fuse and it's affecting your kitchen, and the oven and stove aren't working. Most importantly, the refrigerator's not working. So those things that are necessary to your living aren't receiving the current that they need to serve you. Same is true of the central nervous system. If part of it is blown out or compromised or weakened in any way, your organs, your glands, your muscles, your major systems, your brain not getting the charge it needs to operate optimally. What happens when it's lights out? We've all had the experience of it being dark and the lights go out. And now I'm stumbling around the house. I'm running into things. I'm tripping over things. I can't get to anything. Nothing works. That can happen to us too. It can just feel like the central nervous system is totally blown out. And then as a result, we kind of feel like we're moving through life in the dark, running into things, getting hurt, trying to figure it all out with no lights out. When I choose to tend and befriend in reference to the tough stuff that's in my life, I'm not going to drain my nervous system. In fact, I'm going to give it the rest that it needs so that it can repair itself. I'm going to give it the rest that it needs so that my own energy and my vitality can be restored. So this lays the foundation for the neuroscience of compassion. Because compassion is a version of tending to suffering in a way that is kind and tender and friendly. So just think about those three responses. Think about stress response. I have discomfort. Am I going into stress response? I have discomfort. Am I seeking pleasure and reward as a way of meeting that? Or I have discomfort and I'm going to choose to tend and befriend. And these are all of the gifts and the value of tending and befriending: comfort and stability, a softening, a vulnerability, an openness to closeness and intimacy. I'm not going to be drained. I'll nourish and nurture, repair, and I'm contributing to building up new reserves of energy and vitality. At the top of the hour, the next time that I see you, I want to take you through what is called the tend and befriend practice. We'll do this practice for 5 to 7 minutes. I'll give you a longer version of it, but it gives you an opportunity to actually have the experience within yourself of someone holding for you compassionately something that is causing you a sense of discomfort and unease. But before we go today, I want to leave you with a practice that I would like to have you consider using until I see you next. This is a practice that I probably introduced during another session, and this is a good reminder for it. And this is known as the self-compassion break. And this is how it goes. 3 easy steps. You can practice it anywhere, anytime, and it's a really powerful form of embodied mindfulness. The next time something happens that disturbs your peace, that has you feeling uneasy, the next time something happens that even has a very, very sharp charge to it, or a heated charge to it, first thing you're going to do is pause. And you're going to acknowledge, whoa, I'm having a hard time here. Or traditionally, from the protocol, we would say, acknowledge your suffering by saying, in this moment, I'm suffering. This is really hard, getting triggered here, whatever it is. But call it out. Acknowledge, hey, this is where I'm at within yourself. That's the first step. That's an important step because it means I am willing to wake up to my own discomfort. I'm not afraid of it. Step 2. Once I've acknowledged it, step 2 is to say to yourself, and I know that right now, all over this planet, there are other people who feel just like I do, or who have felt like I do, or will come to feel like I do. In other words, as Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer say in Mindfulness of Self-Compassion, step 2 is acknowledging common humanity. I'm suffering. Step 2, I acknowledge common humanity. I connect to common humanity. Why is that powerful and important? Because it reminds you that you are not alone. Because sometimes in our suffering, what makes the suffering even more difficult is this belief that we are alone in it, that there's no way anyone else could have ever felt this. So we're not saying, hey, there's other people on the planet feeling the same way I'm feeling, or they're going to feel this way, or they have felt this way. We're not saying that to diminish at all the suffering or discomfort we feel. We're saying it to remind ourselves that whatever this is, even if it's really intense, I'm not alone in feeling it. And that should create some solace. And step 3 is really easy to remember, but not easy to practice. And step 3 is be kind, much as you would be kind to anyone, any fellow human being on your journey who you encounter who's suffering. Just be kind. So I want you to carry this with you. When I was first introduced to the self-compassion break, I thought it was BS. It just sounded too simple to be effective. And whenever something like that intrigues me, but at the same time I have that kind of reaction to, I always make myself practice it for a month. And I thought, I'm going to practice this for a solid month. The 3 steps. Wrote it down on the cue card, just as I did with the scarf model, carried it around with me. Every time I felt that discomfort come up, step 1, oh man, I'm suffering here, having a hard time. Step 2, this is hard, and I know that I am not alone in this. I'm part of humanity, and this is something that's common to humanity. And dear Lord, give myself a break by being kind. I became a big advocate for and believer of self-compassion as a result of working with that for a solid month. That practice has become invaluable to me, and it's particularly valuable now. Okay, so I want you to work with that. I invite you to work with that, the self-compassion break. So when I see you next time, let's dive into self-compassion. Why are we afraid of it? Why is it tough for many of us? And most of all, how do we do it? How do we cultivate it? And most interestingly, what's the science behind it? What does the science say? Because science has something to say about self-compassion. So thank you for being here with me today. Again, at the top of the hour next time, I'm going to take you through the Tend and Befriend guided meditation. Have a great day. See you soon.